Hello there, and welcome to another Stay Juicy podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ariana, and today I'm so excited. I have a guest here, Dr. Pauline Maki, who I have known for a few years now. She is one of my favorite researchers, probably the only researcher that I know personally and really have followed their work and understand the depth and all of the important work that has been added to this topic of menopause. So today we're going to welcome Dr. Pauline Maki. Hello, Dr. Pauline. How are you?
Such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. I know you are busy. You're what I call a woman on the glow. And a woman on the glow is a woman who really, despite all of the demands and challenges of this time and season of our lives, is still just doing things, moving the needle, making things happen. And we're going to be talking about all of the wonderful things that you are making happen. But first, I want to introduce you. You have been a pioneer in this field of research around menopause, especially as it is around cognition and brain and function and how all of this has impacted us, our moods, our memory, and just our overall health. Dr. Maki is a professor at the University of Illinois, and she has done, again, just instrumental work. You have, I'm going to let you go into the different schools. You're a professor of obstetrics and gynecology, in psychology, in psychiatry, and women's gender. So tell me a little bit more about your role and exactly what you do at the university.
Yeah, thank you. You know, women, when they go through menopause, they don't need help just about their hot flashes, right? They need help with respect to their complaints of brain fog and mood. And to really be able to answer women's questions, you have to do research that's at the intersection of obstetrics and gynecology, and psychiatry, and psychology. And I bring all of that together. My primary appointment is in the Department of Psychiatry, where I run a large research lab and now a center on menopause. And in addition to that, I'm the research director of a Center for Research on Women and Gender, which is based on women's health generally. I do side research on women and HIV, for example. So my work is generally at this intersection of a lot of the traditional disciplines in medicine.
Yeah, and your work is so important. You actually are really the primary researcher on several NIH grants, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So,
Yeah.
yes, tell us just a little bit more about that. And I remember one time listening to you at a lecture, and I remembered this point of the NIH not even having a category to really study women's health around this menopause specifically. So just give us an idea of the work you're doing at the NIH and then kind of what changes. And I know you have some upcoming things. So it's really exciting. I know this is not necessarily a medical podcast, but I really wanted to help people understand the impact that, you know, just because you're on my podcast, it's a small podcast, but you are just a strong and mighty researcher and doing things. So I want you to just go into a little more detail there, and then we're going to dive into some topics.
Right. So the research that we're doing is really aimed at answering the questions that women ask us. So women are seeking answers to questions like, are my memory changes at menopause normal? Are other cognitive abilities affected? Why am I having these changes? How long will they last? Does this mean that I'm at risk for Alzheimer's disease because I'm experiencing this? They want to understand, am I sad because I'm going through menopause? Am I irritable because I'm going through menopause? What's happening in my brain? And so research on these questions is funded through the federal government through an institute called the National Institutes of Health. And it generates a lot of really important information for our health. So we want to be guided, ideally, by high quality research. When patients ask their providers, is this normal? We want the providers to know if it's normal based on high quality research. Imagine, Dr. Ariana, I have been in this field for almost 30, and I started my research career out actually working at the National Institutes of Health in one of their institutes called the National Institute on Aging. And I was very interested at that time about the question of hormone therapy and its effects on Alzheimer's disease, right? None of us want Alzheimer's disease, right? And if we get hormone therapy, which many of us need to treat our hot flashes, it is the gold standard treatment. We want to know, is it safe? Or might it actually protect my brain, right? These are important questions because women rightly fear Alzheimer's disease. 2/3 of individuals living with Alzheimer's disease are women, and we know that Black women in particular are at increased risk. And so our work is guided by these questions. Like, for example, we just got a grant last month. My PhD researcher, Alexandra Paget-Blanc, is interested in this idea of whether or not we're seeing a link between sleep problems and cognitive problems in Black and brown women. And might that be something we can intervene on so that when they age, they bring the healthiest brains they can into late life? So that if the pathology of Alzheimer's disease comes, then their brains are more resilient. So the NIH funds studies like this. And when I started out, I was interested in this narrow question: is hormone therapy protective against Alzheimer's disease? Dr. Ariana, we still don't really know because it's not a black and white answer. So the National Institutes of Health, for example, funded my first neuroimaging. That's a brain imaging study where you actually look at the activity in the brain when women are doing things like trying to remember. And then we can ask questions like, what's happening in her brain when she's trying to remember? And does hormone therapy affect? So I say when I was just a puppy, when I was really young, we did the first brain imaging study on hormone therapy in the brain. And what we found is that memory circuits were functioning better in women who were on hormone therapy. But that wasn't our gold standard research. So your audience is going to want to know if interventions work. And the way that we definitively decide that is by taking a group of women, giving half of them the medication of interest and half of them an identical placebo, and we see whether or not those medication has a bigger effect than the placebo. And that's how we really do science. And so we do randomized trials like that on hormone therapy. We do very intensive brain imaging research. As you might imagine, our brains are relatively healthy when we're in our 40s and 50s. So we need to use really powerful brain imaging machines to measure those small changes that are happening in women's brains. And we think we just got a very large grant to do that. And I'm actually heading up another large grant called the Adult Aging Brain Connectome, or AABC study, where we're following women. We're measuring their cognitive function when they're premenopausal, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal. And we're going to see what changes and does that align with their cognitive function, those kinds of questions. And so we're really fortunate here in the United States that we have a federal body that provides funds to answer these questions. And the good news for your audience is they are funding this research. And a lot of that, frankly, has to do with Dr. Jill Biden, who created this Women's
Right.
Health Research Initiative.
Yeah, and I think that was something, not to be political about it, but I just found it interesting that that wasn't something that was talked about so much, because it was really a landmark grants that are being provided now. And this is just unprecedented money that is being spent towards research for women. And this has been a gap for so long. And I'm excited and I thank you, because honestly, maybe you probably don't know, but the last time I heard you speak at the Menopause Society, I was particularly interested in what you were going to be talking about, because the brain has always been interesting to me. And just from my own personal journey, when I was in my mid-20s, I had been pregnant. I had severe preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. Afterwards, I ended up having a stroke and really I feel like I've had some, I don't want to say nothing's ever been quite the same since, but I've still obviously have some cognition left. But it's always been interesting to me how these things have impacted my brain. And when you're in one of your lectures, when you spoke about this idea that these hot flashes were not just hot flashes. Like in my mind, hot flashes were just an inconvenience, a little nuisance. I had been taking hormone therapy for really probably at least the last 10 years, if not more. And, I, sometimes had them, sometimes didn't, but more recently having more hot flashes. But when I heard in this lecture that in your work, you're realizing that with these hot flashes, it's actually affecting our brain. And we're seeing these small ischemic like lesions in the brain. And it just really hit home to me. In fact, I came home and I was like, I'm going to take some Vioza on top of all this, something. I got to stop having these hot flashes. But it concerned me, but I was appreciative because I think for most of us, we think hot flash. Yeah. So what? It's just a hot flash, not a big deal. But in your work, you've actually seen that it is affecting our brain. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes, that's right. And thanks for the question. I'm sorry you suffered preeclampsia and a stroke at such a young age. That's a lot. That's a lot to deal with, right? Our
It was a
brain
lot.
health, and you're exemplifying resilience. I mean, you're a star. So it's great to see that kind of resilience to these challenges to our brain health. We do think hot flashes are another challenge to our brain health. It's not a definitive causal association. We haven't firmly established that yet, though we do have some data to suggest that maybe hot flashes cause these. So let me tell you a little bit about the work. So what we do in our research studies is we measure hot flashes objectively. We have women wear wearable devices and we measure the number of hot flashes they have. Now, how do we do that? When we have hot flashes, we sweat, and we have little electrodes that women wear on the surface of their sternum. And when they have a hot flash, the monitors pick up that change in sweating, meaning skin conductance. And we can measure the number of hot flashes women have during the day and actually while they're sleeping. And it's really important that we measure the hot flashes in this way because we don't always report the hot flashes that we have, especially when we're sleeping. But even sometimes during waking hours, we're not always aware of them. So the work that I'm going to be talking about is really based on this kind of hard scientific outcome of the hot flashes that we can measure. So what do those hot flashes that we can measure tell us? Well, firstly, I'll tell you that women have many more hot flashes than they're aware of. So our record, if you can imagine, is 51 hot flashes in one day. 51 hot flashes in
Wow.
one day. And so there's a tremendous amount of suffering out there from these hot flashes. And I like to say that because I think a lot of us don't appreciate that for some women, certainly not all women, but for some women, hot flashes, they cause significant impairment in their well-being. So what we find is that when we correlate the number of hot flashes that our monitors detect with memory performance, we find that the more hot flashes women have, the worse their memory performance. Then we did some brain imaging studies and we had women perform memory tasks and we looked at the brain images to see how the brain was functioning when they were performing those tasks. And what we found is that the more hot flashes a woman had, the worse her brain functioned. Her brain had to work a little bit harder. Then we looked at markers of Alzheimer's disease in the blood. So it turns out that we can measure biomarkers, little signs of Alzheimer's disease in the blood. And what we found is the more hot flashes a woman had, the more of these Alzheimer's disease markers we could detect in the blood. And as you mentioned earlier, we also looked at, brain structure. And women have and men have these tiny little, what we call ischemic or stroke-like lesions. They're tiny, tiny. We accumulate these naturally as we age. If we have high blood pressure, we accumulate more of these. And what we found out is if we have hot flashes, we accumulate more of these. So, minimally, what our research suggests is that if we're a woman who has moderate to severe hot flushes, it's likely that our memory is worse, that our memory systems aren't functioning well, that our brain has these stroke-like lesions, and that we may have these Alzheimer's disease biomarkers. Now, is it causal? I've done one randomized trial where I randomized women to a non-hormonal intervention for their hot flashes, and that took away 50% of their moderate to severe hot flashes. So it worked. An anesthesia procedure called stellate ganglion blockade. I was interested in whether or not women's memory recovered. In other words, when their hot flashes got better, did their memory recover? And the answer was yes, their memory recovered to the extent that their hot flashes improved. So that was the first kind of test of the hypothesis that maybe this is causal. And now we're continuing work to determine whether or not the hot flashes might cause these brain problems and these memory problems. And importantly, we're asking questions about what role does sleep play in that?
Exactly. And I
Exactly.
think sleep for so many of us, you know, we're busy, we're working, moms, just doing all the things. And, you know, sleep is sometimes just considered a luxury, but it's not a luxury. And the more I understand this, the more I'm like being very intentional about going to sleep, because just because you can function on 5-6 hours of sleep doesn't mean that that's, you know, ideal. And so some of the work that you have looked at and that I've researched myself is around this idea that sleep is important because of how it helps restore our brain. And if we don't get that adequate sleep, like it's, you know, I think in our minds, at least in my mind, it's like, well, I feel good. It's okay. I don't feel necessarily sleepy or tired, but it's important for me to understand the why of why I need to sleep. And that why became important when I understood that as we're sleeping, it's actually a period where our brain is kind of being flushed of toxins, so to speak, during that we accumulate. And we need this time, this restorative time. And if we don't get that, can you tell us a little bit more about what is the like real impact of not getting sleep? Like it's one thing to just say, oh, you should exercise and this will help. But when we have, thanks to you, the data around, okay, if you don't sleep, then this is exactly what's happening in your brain. So help us understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important question. And we should say that menopause does have an effect on our sleep. So 69% of women say that their sleep is worse, up to 69%, depending on the cohort study. We've just published a review of this in the journal Menopause. So it's a very common complaint. So I'm very glad that you're asking these questions for your audience, because menopause does appear to play a role in sleep dysfunction, and hot flashes contribute to that because 75% of the time when we have a hot flash, we wake up. So sleep and menopause, what effect might that have on the brain? Well, we know in the field of Alzheimer's disease that getting good sleep routinely is an excellent way of lowering your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And I like to say you don't need a researcher to tell you that your brain functions better when you've slept well, or that your brain is not functioning well after chronic sleep deprivation, night after night after night. And Dr. Ariane, I think what's happening at midlife, and this is a major hypothesis of ours, is that women are experiencing menopause related sleep disruptions, and they occur in two general types. One are the awakenings that are triggered when we have a hot flash, and we do wake up 75 to 78% of the time. We're waking up when we have those hot flashes. And think of that woman who's having 5 to 8 hot flashes a night, then she's waking up. Waking up when we want to be sleeping is the major change in our sleep as we transition through the menopause. But most of the awakenings that we experience during the night have nothing to do with hot flashes. So although hot flashes reliably
Mm.
make us become awake, most of the time that we spend awake have nothing to do with hot flashes. So women are not getting restful sleep. They're having poor sleep continuity. And what effect does that have on the brain? As you mentioned, it turns out that science is now telling us that maybe one of the reasons that we evolved as a species to sleep is because during the nighttime, there is a wave, like a mechanical wave, like you would see in the ocean, that pushes these toxins or these precursors to toxins out of our cerebral spinal fluid so that our brain, if you will, gets refreshed during sleep. And it's a way of optimizing brain health. One hypothesis that we're exploring is this idea that because women have hot flashes and because they experience sleep changes due to menopause, they have a unique risk factor for brain problems as they age, one that involves menopause. And you'd think that people would have thought about this a long time. And there are, wonderful pioneers in this area, Fiona Baker being, an excellent one. But what we're doing is we're linking that sleep problem to memory problems. And we find, for example, that sleep problems, the more sleep problems we have, and we measure these objectively too. We have women wear monitors and we measure their sleep. The more time they spend awake and the worse their sleep efficiency, which simply means when you want to be sleeping, are you? And you quantify that. The greater the changes in memory circuitry in the brain. And these memory circuits have to, if you will, become rewired, that you need an alternate path to perform cognitive tests. And then the typical connections that our brain makes when we're trying to learn and remember, those connections struggle, if you will. And women have to work harder to form those connections. And so one of our goals is to see whether if we intervene on sleep, can we restore those brain circuits? And the way that we intervene on sleep is with cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. That's the gold standard treatment for sleep disruption, because sleep, for your audience, how do you improve your sleep? And science says you don't want to take a pill. What you want to do is you want to train your brain to fall asleep. You want to see sleep as a habit. You want to engage in sleep hygiene, and I'm sure you talk to your patients about that. You want to go to bed at the same time every night. You want to avoid caffeine and too much alcohol late at night. You do not want to work in your room. The bedroom's only for sex and sleep. That's it. Because what your brain does if you do other activities is your brain learns this is not a place where I can rest. If your brain sees your bedroom as a place that's associated with sleep, it will more easily fall asleep, if you will. So you have to train your brain. Your brain almost engages in a Pavlovian-like conditioning. It's in a context and it responds to it. It's like walking by a Starbucks and suddenly, you want a coffee because you're walking by Starbucks. You want to go into your bedroom and you want your body to respond like it's the place that you sleep, right? So we have to build the sleep habit. Our brains have to get used to the bedroom environment is a sleeping environment. And when women do this, when they train, when they do the CBT work, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, it works very, very well. The American Academy for Sleep Medicine recommends this as the gold standard. And the good news is that it's free. There are free apps online. The Veterans Administration has one, for example. So this is a really good way to help our brains function. But if we're having those hot flashes at night, we also need to treat those because those are going to be triggering those awakenings.
And yes, give us some information on exactly where, if somebody's like, okay, I want to do this cognitive behavioral therapy, what are some of the resources or where exactly would they look to find that?
Yeah, I think you could Google cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, VA. And I think it will take you right to the Veterans Administration free CBT-I. And a lot of work went into the development of that particular intervention. We're working right now on a big grant to the MacArthur Foundation where, if we get funded, it's a huge grant. If we get funded, we're going to aim to deploy a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention for insomnia, mood, and hot flashes to women globally. So women need these answers, and it would be great if these were publicly available.
What made you just pursue this? I mean, you're a pioneer in this area. You're a researcher, a mother, a mentor, and
Yeah.
again, this is an area that you're clearly passionate about. But what's your story? How did you get here
Yeah.
to just do this work?
So, like many women who choose their professions, it's kind of aligned, if we're fortunate, if we have that luxury, aligned with kind of our values and what's important to us. And when I was pursuing my PhD, I was very interested in memory generally, but I was also part of the lipstick feminist movement of the 1980s, and was very curious about women in Alzheimer's disease, knowing in particular that women had a higher rate of Alzheimer's disease compared to men if they had the most common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I thought, how come people aren't talking about this? We need to know more about women and Alzheimer's disease. I was also very much an adherent to this musical movement called the Riot Girl movement, which was a kind of pro-woman, alternative kind of punk rock movement. And I aligned, if you will, my values around feminism with my research interests. And that's how I ended up proposing very first neuroimaging study of hormones in women's brains. And I've been on that journey ever since. I'll also say that my paternal grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, and I was motivated as well to try to understand what factors might have contributed to her dementia, although now I think that it was probably fall related, not necessarily the typical Alzheimer's disease pathway, but nonetheless, a good life is one where you try to help a lot of people, right? Where at the end of your life, you say, what have I done for the world? And, when everything else around me is, we all live in our own universes, and when the climate is changing and the political environment might not be what we want, it's good to know at the end of the day that you do what you can, So I'm fortunate to be able to contribute in the way that I wanted to. And I'm inherently motivated by the work. Nobody ever has to tell me, "Oh, get up and work." I love my work. I love what I do. I love seeing the results of it. I especially enjoy mentoring. So I'm fortunate.
You are. Do you realize you're a badass? Like, do you embrace that? Or you're in a field where, everybody's kind of doing the work, right? And especially in academia, the short time that I was in there during my fellowship, nobody's really a star because we're all kind of doing work, but you really are like changing the world. Do you feel that? Do you own that at this?
It's a very interesting question. Yeah, I would say that I've become more aware of it in the last 2 years. So when I was I was asked to consult with a good colleague of mine, Dr. Carolyn Missouri, on Jill Biden's Women's Health Research Initiative. And, she called me and she said, Pauline, I really want your insights into what are the gaps in knowledge in menopause. And because I've been in this field forever, and was president of the North American Menopause Society, and now I'm with the International Menopause Society. I have a pretty expansive and historic view of what have been the gaps, what have been the barriers, the pendulum swinging, from hormone therapy being for everyone to hormone therapy killing you to hormone therapy being okay if you have hot flashes and maybe even the best option, and that's the view now. So I spoke to her about my take. And she said, well, if it's okay with you, I would like you to be an informal consultant on this. And I said, I'm at your disposal. I love what you're doing. Let's get menopause on the research agenda. Then she wrote me sometime in October, maybe November last year. And she said, we may be interested in coming to your lab. And I said, yeah, you're welcome. It never occurred to me that she meant the first lady, right? I just thought it was her and she was gathering information. So I was heading to Hawaii with my daughter, my wonderful daughter, Anna Sophia, for our holiday vacation. We stayed at a mango farm. It was so fun. It was just great. Middle of nowhere, frogs everywhere. Anyway, and I was hopping on the plane to go there, and I thought I better text Carolyn because she mentioned something about the second week of January. I better text her. So I texted her and I said, Carolyn, I'm heading out to Hawaii. Just you mentioned, maybe visiting our lab the second week. So I'm just checking, assuming that nothing's happening. And she texted. She said, "Are you available for a call?" And my mind went, "Why would she call me?" Uh-oh. So she called and she said, "Yeah, we're looking into having the first lady come to your lab in Chicago." So this happened in 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to prepare, contacted my graduate students on vacation because I wanted to highlight the work that they're doing. They're the future of menopause. And it was funny. They knew something was up because I say vacation is for vacation. You need to restore and, yourselves. And so they became suspicious. So I had a cover story because the Secret Service told me I couldn't tell anybody that she was coming. So I said, we have a documentary crew panel coming. And then one of my graduate students, one of the more senior ones, said, Jill Biden must be coming. She said that to the graduate students. And so we prepped. And when Jill Biden came and then Halle Berry came, and then I was invited to the White House, and then they asked me to do some press, and then the Morning America thing, and now this $100 million MacArthur Foundation grant. Yeah, I think I see the data and it's telling me that, yeah, we're getting the word out. And it might be nice on a personal level, but I'm not just saying it. I'm really just very excited for women because this topic is out in the open. The first lady comes and talks about how we need menopause research, how important it is, how a woman shouldn't walk into her doctor's office, ask a question only to be faced by, I don't know, I wasn't trained in menopause. I mean, it makes no sense. How come we don't have information about this universal life event? The thing that I'll say is every OBGYN knows how to treat chlamydia, but they don't know what to do with menopause. And all women go through menopause. What's wrong with our society? And so, yeah, I think the good news is that society is paying attention, and I do my part.
Well, you're very, very humble, but in case no one's told you, because you are, again, kind of in these circles, but you really are, you're changing the world. And I think as women of a certain age, we just have to be reminded. I would call you, again, a woman on the glow, and a woman who is not really dealing with the stereotypes of what this age and time could mean, but you're just getting started and making things happen. So I just want to continue to toot your horn on that. And on that note,
well, thanks. That's very nice
it's
coming
kind of not that note,
from the
but
woman on the glow.
well, thank you. I will tell you, the first time I met you, I mean, this is my imposter syndrome. We were on the Society for Women's Health Research panel,
Yeah.
and we worked on a menopause toolkit. And when I was invited to be on that panel, I was confused because I was like, well, these are like Harvard emeritus, these are past presidents of ACOG and menopause. And I was like, well, why did they ask me to come? I didn't quite understand. And I think I still understand now, but I think, no matter what, for some of us, how accomplished we might be in our careers, there's still a sense of imposter syndrome, or just not necessarily just taking all the credit for the work that you've done. And so I know for me, I have changed lots of lives, on a personal level in terms of treating women through this transition. And that was really, again, informed by my personal experience, because as a OBGYN, I started going through menopause or perimenopause in my mid 30s, but I had no idea that that's what was happening. In fact, I remember doing a case. I was doing a C-section one day, a procedure I had done at least 1,000 times. And I remember being in the middle of that case and my brain just going blank. I couldn't remember what the next step was. It was just as if I had just lost. And I was like, oh my God. And again, I had a maternal grandmother who had Alzheimer's, and my mom always kind of had that in my ear, like, oh, that's in our family. It's in our family. I knew I didn't have the ApoE4 gene, but I still was worried. And I thought at that moment, like, I think I'm getting early Alzheimer's. I think something's really wrong. And luckily I had a assistant, a resident that was eager to take over the reins and finish the case and it never skipped a beat. But all that to say, it scared me. And I just recognized that this is, well, I didn't recognize it at that point. I just thought I was maybe getting early Alzheimer's. So fast forward, years went by until I figured out that I was actually perimenopausal. And the joke that I always tell is that it's the moment I knew it was when my husband, when I literally was like, I'm going to kill him. Like I felt homicidal. It's like, I'm literally going to get some poison. I'm going to figure out how we're going to get rid of this dude. And I tell you, we're still married, still 25 years, but it was some rough patches there. I think.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. And we're going through so many changes with our brain and it's unfortunate, like you said, that women will go to a provider and be dismissed because they don't understand or they are not informed or up to speed with the latest data. Then, they're just giving wrong information, telling people they don't believe in hormone therapy or, just kind of grin and bear it, get through it. And it's such a disservice. Our lack of understanding around this topic is such a disservice to women. So the work is super important. And you mentioned something, and just still in the area of sleep. And I think a lot of us as well are self-medicating to sleep. Now, you mentioned the cognitive behavioral therapy, which I would say the average person that's not the first thing. What the average patient I see is going to think that a glass of wine is going to help them sleep.
Right.
I recognized that wasn't helping me sleep. I was getting hot flashes and I was like, well, wine gave me hot flashes, but vodka did not. So I realized, early on that there were some tweaks I could make. I don't drink hardly now at all. But my question is how, in terms of this self-medication, whether it's alcohol, cannabis, what all the things that we're doing, how is that really affecting our brain in long term in terms of our memory and through this whole process?
Yeah. And I think this is a really important question. And, I hate to give women another to do, like I don't want to tell women you can't have that glass of wine at night, right? I mean, we work really hard. We bear a lot of family responsibilities disproportionate. We balance careers, children, parents. And I think what we want to tell women is moderation, just moderation. So refraining from drinking might be the answer for some women, especially if they're having a lot of memory problems. They might want to experiment with that. Now we have this idea that no amount of alcohol is healthy. That's what the data suggests. So we want to keep alcohol to a minimum. According to the National Institutes of Health, what that means for women is like to maximum of 1 drink a night, no more than 7 per week, which is, something a lot of women can do. And a lot of other women need to kind of change their habits to stay within that. The irony about alcohol in sleep is that alcohol makes us sleepy, but it actually disrupts sleep. And it's interesting, Matthew Walker did a study showing that just one glass will disrupt our sleep. So the idea is that if you're going to have a glass of wine, have it earlier in the evening, not later in the evening, and don't use it to promote sleep because it might help you to fall asleep. It might help you with that goal, but it won't help you to maintain your sleep. Now, this is a big challenge for a lot of women because up to 69% of women experience sleep difficulties, and they're looking for quick and easy solutions, preferably something you can take, right? So alcohol will make us relaxed, but it will ironically interfere with our sleep. So that's not a good solution. Cannabis isn't cannabis because one strain of cannabis differs from the next, which makes it very challenging for researchers to investigate. And the other aspect of cannabis is that it can have these carryover effects the next day on our cognitive function, on our mood, etc. So that's not an optimal solution for women. So the question is then, what do we do? And that's why organizations like the American Academy of Sleep Medicine really recommend cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia as the evidence-based approach for sleeping. And the effect size, meaning its impact objectively in research studies, is very large. And there's no carryover effect. There's no adverse events. Once you have these tools in your kind of toolbox, you can call them out when you need to. It helps us to associate our bed with sleeping. It helps us to go back to sleep when we do awaken. It helps us to build really good sleep habits. And that's why it works. Sleep is going to be a habit that women are going to need to hone as they transition through the menopause. I think in general, it's better to build healthy habits than it is to rely on a substance. But I agree, we don't think about, let me do a lifestyle intervention for my sleep, right? We want to take a pill and have it work.
I think we just want a break, right? We want to relax. We're tired. We just want to get out of our head. And
That's right.
it's just such an easy reach. It's sometimes
Right.
habitual. For me, I used to come home from work and I would literally put my stuff down. I'd go change my clothes. I'd go pour a glass of wine, and then I would go and start dinner. It was just a habit, right? And it wasn't even like I needed the wine. It was just a part of my ritual, but it was this is for me.
Yeah, it was
This
your
is my
time.
time. And this is my little happy place, right? We have to be honest about the stress in our lives. And at this point where, like you mentioned, we're peaking in our careers, we are launching, children out of the nest. We are dealing with aging parents. We're just dealing with our own changes of what's happening in our own minds and lives. And so we really need to find a way that's healthy for us to age in a way that's going to sustain us. But to me, it's just this tug and pull of I want to do something that makes me feel good, which I think is that, or, thinking of really what the long-term consequences are and just finding and understanding. And so that's why I think this conversation is important, because if we at least understand, okay, I think that this alcohol is making me feel better or do this for me. In actuality, it's disrupting my sleep. It's not in any way helping my brain. And it's certainly not helping, my risk in terms of all other types of diseases, including, cancer, right?
Right. Right. And that's where moderation, I think, comes in. I think my main message to women generally is be kinder to yourself. And, those negative self thoughts that we can have, would you say out loud to your best friend the thoughts that you tell yourself? Probably not,
Most
right?
days, no.
Probably not. So why are we so hard on ourselves? Part of it's just our brain wiring. So, to take an example of this, if this inner dialogue is, oh, you fool, you can't be drinking this glass of wine tonight, even though you're really stressed because you're increasing your risk of cancer. Maybe that dialogue instead is, you know what, I'm going to really enjoy this glass of wine tonight. I'm going to refrain for the next couple of days. It's this moderation kind of thing. And I'm going to be kind to myself by moderating my alcohol use for the rest of the week, but I'm going to allow myself this kind of indulgence, especially if we're doing things for our brain and for our bodies that are healthy, right? Especially if we're exercising. A lot of people really find a lot of relief in meditation. I've been doing biking lately. That's my new kind of outlet, So find whatever that is. And the other thing, I don't know, I'd be curious as to what you think. I think sometimes we go as much to our phones as we do to substances, so that if we're feeling bored or lonely, we get stuck into watching reels or going to social media and looking at things. And I think that research shows that kind of triggers our reward system. It's like gambling. They know exactly how to
Yeah.
get us in. And I think our mental well-being and our stress could be managed a lot better if we resisted that, if you will, easy solution. And if we read a bit, or we called a friend and had a conversation instead, if we took a walk outside, if it's safe, if we put on our favorite dance music from the 2000s and we danced in our kitchen. I think also this idea of easy access to diversions in our phone is problematic for our well-being. Do you see that in
It is,
your
but
own life?
again, I see it personally and I see it definitely in patients, and
Yeah.
it's a way of life. And, telling people
Hmm.
to not scroll social media and not drink alcohol is literally, I get side eyed. Like
Right.
people are like, wait, what? Like, what else am I going to do? Like, this is my relief. And so I guess I'm just trying to respect the data, that these things aren't best for us, but trying to figure out how to better navigate that. And to that extent, also around depression, because depression
Yeah.
in this period can be significant. And just, we're going to
Yeah.
have a certain amount of this that comes with the territory. And obviously, some women are more predisposed to really being susceptible to this. So give us a little more insight
Yeah.
on what we can expect around that.
So in the field, we distinguish between depressive symptoms and major depressive disorder, or what we would call clinical depression. So depressive symptoms are symptoms of sadness, blues, loss of interest in activities and people and hobbies and our work, or even our relationships. So we don't find them as rewarding, but the level of those symptoms does not significantly disrupt our ability to carry out our daily activities. When those types of symptoms affect our ability to carry out our daily activities, like we can't get up in the morning, for example, we can't find any pleasure in our work, so we just can't find the energy to do our work. When that functional disruption occurs in relation to those symptoms, that's when we want to talk to a provider about perhaps getting treatment for those symptoms, when they're so disruptive that we can't function in our work or our personal lives. So menopause menopause affects both of those. Up to 60% of women report a worsening of depressive symptoms as they enter the menopause, so in the perimenopause. And also, the perimenopause is a window of vulnerability for major depressive disorder. The research indicates that the large majority of women who experience major depressive disorder, so the kind of functional disruptions, those are women who have had a history of depression in the past. So this is a recurrence. Perimenopause is a window of vulnerability to the many of us who've had depression in the past, right? About 20-25% of women will have had this. What causes this? You mentioned the symptoms of menopause. Those certainly play a role. The hormonal changes also play a role. And it might surprise your listeners to learn what hormonal changes are, if you will, causing these. So we think about hormones in the perimenopause is declining, right? Because our ovaries are shutting down. During the perimenopause, as you well know, our hormone levels can also spike. We can have very high surges of estrogen. And it turns out that it's that variation, that fluctuation, those changes in estrogen that trigger our moods. So the female brain likes predictable estrogen levels and likes predictable progesterone levels. So when we go through an estrogen withdrawal, like at the end of our menstrual cycles, like after pregnancy, like the perimenopause, that change is what triggers it. So it's not the loss of estrogen per se. It's not like we become depressed in the postmenopause when our estrogen levels are flat. We get depressed in the perimenopause initially when those changes in estradiol occur. And then we get sleep disruption, in part due to the hot flashes. And then those symptoms continue well beyond the final menstrual period, right? So Black women experience hot flashes for, on average, 10 years, right? So that means 50% of Black women have hot flashes for more than 10 years. So those hot flashes can continue to disrupt sleep and the like. And when we're experiencing especially chronic sleep deprivation, our moods get affected, right? So it's both the changes in hormones and the symptoms of menopause that are associated with these blues. But the good news is that in the perimenopause, we can take away those fluctuations by giving women oral contraceptives, and that will flatten out. And there's science to show that you can use hormones to flatten that out, and women respond beautifully to it. Many women with a history of depression found successful treatment with an SSRI or an NRI, so an antidepressant pill. Many found help with psychotherapy. So those are the two options they should go to when they get depressed in the perimenopause as well. And then there's lots of ways we get depressed in the postmenopause. We need to think about
Right.
treating the symptoms that relate to our mood. And then the contest could be more nuanced. So here's the idea. Let's say I have a sick parent and I need to balance my work schedule, my family schedule, etc., right? With this new stressor. If I was in a
Yes.
premenopausal hormonal state, my brain could handle that stress differently than it can now that I'm in a perimenopausal state. Okay, so it's the combination of the life stressor plus the fact that my hormones are changing. And there's beautiful scientific evidence to support that idea. So then we want to take away that hormonal fluctuation so that our brains can handle that life stressor a little bit better. Now, if the life stressor is sick parents, relationships breaking down, needing to adapt to the thought that we can't reproduce anymore, if that was a goal for us, or if we're uncomfortable aging, that requires a therapist. You need to talk to somebody. You need to get that negative thinking out into the open and get help thinking in a new way about your life. And all the hormones in the world aren't going to help you with that, right? So it depends. You have to think really deeply about what the
Right.
drivers of that are. But menopause symptoms and hormone fluctuations, especially in the perimenopause and early postmenopause, are drivers.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about ADHD. This is also a topic where I have
Yeah.
found some personal interest and just trying to understand in terms of managing patients. There's not only, the sleep disruption, the hot flashes, the brain fog, depression, all of these things we're managing. But what I'm also seeing are women coming in and they're just like, I can't do what I used to do. And when we go through the list, it looks exactly like ADHD. And so help us understand the difference between the fact that a lot of women weren't diagnosed initially with ADHD just because of the fact that they were women and we didn't understand it as well, 30, 40 years ago, versus what's happening in our brain that can make this look exactly like ADHD.
Yeah. So let's start with what we know about the brain changes as women enter menopause. So we have really high quality data where we test a variety of different mental abilities, whether it's attention, the speed with which we do basic tasks, our ability to learn and remember, our ability to strategize and do other executive functions. There's one reliable signal in the 6 studies that have been done to date, and that is that our memory functioning changes, so our ability to learn and remember. So that forgetfulness is very common during the menopause, and we understand that it's a normal symptom of the menopause, which is good because women worry that they're getting Alzheimer's disease because their memory is changing, but this is a hormone thing. This is not pathology of Alzheimer's disease. In recent years, thanks largely to some really wonderful work by Neil Epperson, there is data to show that a subset of women complain of and meet criteria for ADHD. So that if you give some of the same scales that you would give to a teenager and ask, are you having these symptoms? A subset of women in the peri and postmenopause kind of report these. We don't yet know if this is emergent, meaning we haven't yet given those same scales to women, large groups of women, as they're transitioning through the menopause. We're doing that now in our new grant. So I hope that we'll know the answer to that, to know how many of women actually experience this. But what we do know is that some women certainly do, and that treating those women with ADHD-like medications, at least in this one clinical trial, did help them to perform better on those tests of attention and executive control, and also changed some aspects of their brain function. So there's really good initial data to suggest that there might be a there, but we need much more research to determine whether or not, is this something like I'm getting Alzheimer's disease, that thought? Am I attributing my subjective experience of my brain problems as being attributable to Alzheimer's disease or being attributable to ADHD, when really there's something unique about menopause, but we don't have the right label for it yet. So we're just using these other labels. So it could be ADHD-like, right? Or Alzheimer's disease-like, but really what it is it's an experience that shares some of the features of those two, but without being one of those two things.
So in terms of treatment, assuming she has not been officially diagnosed, if a woman is perimenopausal, menopausal, feeling, again, those symptoms like ADHD, you're saying that based on the limited research and the information we have, that the treatment of, with, for example, stimulants could be a reasonable treatment to consider for them during this period?
Yeah, it could be. I would want to first start with the basics. How are her hot flashes? How is she sleeping? And I would want to start with, if you will, what is more established about in the menopause field about what contributes to changes in our cognitive function. So I would start out treating those first and then see,
Right.
is her brain functioning better? If her brain functioning is not better and her symptoms are well monitored, then perhaps you could off-label experiment with a psychostimulant and see whether or not for that particular woman this might be a good solution. I'll tell you, in general, in longitudinal studies, we don't see changes in executive function in women. Abilities have been measured. They haven't been measured really well, so there is not yet a strong signal that this is a universal or common experience. But my menopause isn't your menopause, and it might make sense that some women who were just on the border of having ADHD, maybe when their cognitive control circuits in the brain, kind of the captain that says, do that, turn that off, regulate this, that system undergoes a change as well in a subset of women. If the symptoms are really disruptive, then one could experiment. And I suppose it could be a good test of whether or not that was in fact the cause of their cognitive problems, because if their symptoms normalize when you treat them with a psychostimulant, then maybe that indicates, a disruption in that brain circuit. I think this is where personalized medicine comes in. So we can think about two general categories of factors that are driving women's complaints of inattention and memory. One is a hormonal driver, and the hormonal drivers in the perimenopause appear to be the fluctuations in hormones, not the loss, but the fluctuations in hormones that occur during the perimenopause. Research on the factors that lead us to be depressed or irritable or anxious in the perimenopause suggests that it's the fluctuations that matter. So in the perimenopause, the idea would be, if you want to treat the hormonal drivers of your psychological or perhaps even the cognitive issues, that you want to take away that variability. You want to suppress that variability. And the way to do that is with an oral contraceptive. That's the way. It controls the cycle. And indeed, a lot of menopause practitioners will put a woman on an oral contraceptive when she's perimenopausal and keep her on until she's past the typical age of menopause and then deal with it. So that's the perimenopause. Hormonal drivers in the postmenopause would not be the variability, but rather the decline in estrogen. And there, for women, especially those women who have hot flashes, you're going to want to treat with hormone therapy or even a non-hormonal intervention for hot flashes. Now, the other potential driver, when we have hot flashes, we have surges in cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone, and that might affect our cognitive function, especially if we're a woman of color who's having many more hot flashes than other women. Those hot flashes are more severe and they're more long lasting, right? So it makes sense, perhaps that might be a driver of the findings that I found in my study with attention and working memory. Like the stress hormone milieu, that environment may be different in women with, moderate to severe persistent hot flashes. Now, those are the hormonal drivers. So again, variability in the perimenopause, loss of estrogen in the postmenopause. What are the other drivers? The other drivers don't have to deal necessarily with hormones, but rather symptoms. So if I am chronically sleep deprived, I'm not going to be able to organize my thoughts, my thinking. I'm not going to be able to pay attention. So chronic sleep deprivation is certainly a driver of inattention. So if you're a woman with that experience, then you're going to want to do a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia approach to treating that. And chances are your cognitive abilities will rebound because sleep is so important for our brain health. Our mood is also really important for brain health. If we're sad, if we're anxious, we can't think as clearly as we can when those symptoms are lower, right? So we need to think about treating our mood symptoms. And then finally, the hot flashes, as I mentioned earlier. We have evidence that hot flashes have a direct effect on our brain, not just because they wake us up, but there's another path to cognitive. So if we're having a lot of hot flashes and we treat those hot flashes, we may find that our cognitive abilities rebound. Now, I would love to tell you that we have great quality randomized trials in this area to direct you to a kind of algorithm, to a kind of chart, if then, but this is more conceptual, more theoretical. But in general, what we're talking about is think about the hormonal drivers and think about the symptom drivers and think about how you might want to treat those in order to optimize your cognitive functioning.
So much that we can talk about there. Thank you. Definitely want to circle back at some point and talk about, again, what happens to us after. Because I feel like it's like then somehow we get to this point and then everything is supposed to snap back to normal, but it's not snapping back to normal. Like there's still this shift, there's still this change that's happened. And I can speak for myself. It's like I'm still feel like we've defined menopause. But then I feel like there's stages after that. There's another stage, and then I'm going through another stage, and it's totally undefined, and it's obviously going to be unique for every person. But it's like the changes don't stop. Like this isn't like the last change, right? Ultimately there's just more and more changes. We just don't have a name for them. Maybe they're not as much of a syndrome and look as similar as the big transition, but we're still transitioning. And this is kind of the message that I tell my patients is that you're never going to be, are we there yet? Am I in menopause? It doesn't matter. We're not there yet. You're not going to be there. It's not a destination. It's a continuum. You're on this, for every person, you're going to continue to change, but that's going to look a little bit different maybe after you go through the big change.
Yeah, I think what you're saying certainly resonates with the literature, the scientific literature for women with persistent menopause symptoms, right? For the many of us who continue to experience sleep changes that are new for us, or mood changes that are new, or even hot flashes, that, it is a continuous journey. That being said, most women do adapt. Most women do adapt to this biologically, eventually. And indeed, quality of life, positive mood increases. It actually increases in research studies. But that doesn't mean it does so for every woman. And there are a lot of women, especially those who see really great providers like you, who come to you because they happen to be one of those women whose lives took a different kind of trajectory after the menopause transition. My view is that a lot of that has to do with persistent untreated symptoms, and that we need to wait until those symptoms resolve. And they do resolve, right? They do resolve. The hot flashes resolve for most women. Sleep, not so much. But it's a journey for women, and you need really good personalized care. And we need to realize that aging itself affects our sleep, aging affects our cognition, aging affects our mood. And the conditions that we begin to experience, especially heart disease, has an effect on our mood and our sleep and our overall well-being. So as we age, we're also accumulating more prediabetes, more hypertension, more elevated lipids, and those other medical conditions contribute to the same kind of clusters of symptoms that menopause does. So it's a very complicated kind of experience from a biological perspective.
You got that right. I can appreciate that on every single level. Again, we talk about the menopause, but we need to talk about just at the end of the day, our aging and how, all of these things impact how we're going to feel, because it's just you're not just going to get through menopause and then it's done. Like, it may be that, okay, because of these other factors that are sinking in, that this is affecting this as well, because these things are also changing at the same time. So it is complicated. I am my own research. I am my own study. So I use most of my
I'm the same way.
symptoms, but I'm like, okay, this is what's happening. Like, there's something else going on here, but I'm an N of one, but I know that there's more to it than just going through that menopause. But thank you so much for adding the science to what we are already experiencing, what I feel like intuitively, like what I know. But it's always nice to have a PhD neuroscientist to keep you in check and let you know you're not crazy, and that all of these things
Oh, we're not
actually do
crazy.
exist. There's
No, don't
studies
let
that
anybody
support
tell you
them.
you're crazy. You got to bond together, be kind to yourselves, and do the best you can without taking on too much more.
Yeah, and I do feel that. I feel all the things. Like, I feel the anxiety. I have the issue with the sleep. I have the ADHD, but I also have a joy and, a
Yes.
peace and just a happiness around the rest of my life. So I'm balancing all of it, but it's like we're always wanting all the things to line up beautifully and everything just to be
Yeah.
okay. But it's like, oh no, here's another one. Okay, here we
Right.
go. We got to deal with this thing over here. And I do think that the stressors, my parents are aging. They're, 85. I got kids that, haven't quite launched,
Yep.
and, just dealing with my own life. It's like, it does feel like a period in time where it's like, it's just a lot more stressful too. Like, there's all of these other balls that are in the air that you have to keep up.
Yes.
And then, your brain has to do, the heavy lifting. And some days it's like,
That's right.
we're not doing this today. So, but I appreciate the work that you do. This podcast I started because the idea that I want us as women to have juicy lives, juicy experiences, and even keep our juicy vaginas. So my question to all my guests now is, how do you keep it juicy? Meaning, what do you find in your personal life that helps you feel the most vibrant? And do you have any just ideas or recommendations for any of us on keeping it juicy? But what do you do personally?
Yeah, it's really important to attend to these aspects of our life, right? And what I'm finding right now is I'm working a lot. So, keeping it juicy is a challenge, if you will, because I have very little time as a working mom, and I love motherhood and I love traveling with my daughter, and I feel that my positive well-being is greatly enhanced when I'm seeing something new around the globe, especially with my daughter. Like last weekend, we went to New York and had dinner with friends and saw a Broadway play with Robert Downey Jr. And you just feel very much alive and a part of life when you engage like that. My latest obsession actually is Peloton. I had knee surgery and couldn't run anymore. So I've become rather obsessed with my Peloton, and I think it's the endorphins that I'm getting from that. And then in my personal life, I'm dating, and that's going well. So life's a balance, right? But I would say right now I am trying to do my best in those few moments that I have to keep it juicy.
I thank you for the work that you've done, for just being a champion for women. You are a woman on the glow. I mean, you are the true superheroes that are helping us understand this better. So thank you again for your time and all your
You're
energies. And
you're
I
welcome.
can't tell you how much I appreciate you. I've
I
learned so much from
appreciate
you.
you. Everything we do can't
So
get to women without people on like you, the menopause experts who can take what we create and deliver it to women. So I appreciate you. So it's a team effort.
it is a team effort. I'm down there in the trenches and
Yes.
doing it,
Yes, you
and you're
are.
in the lab trenches doing it. So it's all good. It's all
It's
good.
all good.
Well, ladies, as usual, we are keeping it juicy. We're talking about all the things, and I hope that you learned something today around really how your brain is working during this time through our expert, Dr. Pauline Maki. We're going to continue to watch her work. I'm going to keep an eye out for all the things that are coming through from your research. And as usual, stay brilliant, stay beautiful, but most of all, we're going to stay juicy. I'll see you on the next one.